and good afternoon, and welcome back to the main stage on this third session. In this session, we'll be focusing on a very important aspects in creating national digital infrastructure under the topic creating digital economy, the role of public sector. It should be very easy for me to convince all of us here in this room that the impact of rapid transformation of technology is very powerful and far-reaching. Advancement of information technology has given rise to various data technologies and also network platform, and that changed the way we live our lives in many ways, and also help uplift productivity for both businesses and individuals. So at the same time, these digital transformation, along with the new landscape they introduced, bring new forms of risk and pose challenges for all of us. For example, the operational risk from IT transformation and also the cyber threats. We also have to deal with the increased competition, disrupted business models, and change in dynamics of our labor market from automation process. So this, I believe, requires both private and public sector to fully play their roles in creating an ecosystem that supports such transformation smoothly. We will discuss today how the public sector could take a more proactive action in order to create greater synergies with digitized private sector and help create effective and sustainable digital economy infrastructure. In this occasion, we are very privileged to have our distinguished panelists from both public and private sectors, as our MC mentioned. They will be joining us here to share their views, expectations, and also experiences on how best the public sector could facilitate and drive forward the digital economy. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panelists on stage. So allow me to briefly introduce our panelists. On my furthest right, we have Mr. Gerald Sun from Mastercard Asia Pacific. His current role is partnering with private and public sector to reap full benefits from the digital advancements. He also has extensive experience in helping large organizations in this region digitize their work processes. Next is Dr. Pakorn Peetathawatchai from the Stock Exchange of Thailand. He has long been involved in the development of the capital market of Thailand. He is also a part of the subcommittee of capital market reform in the National Reform Council. Thirdly, Dr. Segkhoonthod from Electronics Transaction Development Agency, or EDRA, who has extensive exposure in setting Thailand's policy framework to support transition towards digital economy, both in terms of hard and soft infrastructure. Last but not least, the single lady here except me, Ms. Shinjini Kumar from Global Consumer Banking Citi, who manages all the Citi consumer businesses and now also focus on digitization of the entire banking service lifecycle. She used to work as a central banker for almost 20 years at the Reserve Bank of India. And maybe we'll be lucky enough to hear from her about the successful experience of India in transforming towards digital economy. So to carry out our discussion, I plan to have 3 sets of questions. The first one is, what are the outcomes our panelists wish to see in terms of digital transformation for the nation or the sector they're from? The second one is, what can be done to achieve that goal? And the third one will be the challenges they are facing and how to overcome them. So these simply 3 questions. Let me start with our Shinjini. So you've been both in the government sector and private sector, and also you've been with KTM before. So maybe you can tell us a little bit before you go into your outcome in terms of what it's like in India. How does India get to here?
Sure, happy to. And just to start the conversation, I thought it'll be good to put a little bit of a face to the name, that is the Indian digital ecosystem, particularly with respect to what the government and policymakers have done. Because in bits and pieces, you may have heard the stories relating to India stopping cash for everybody suddenly, which was called demonetization. Or you may have heard about the digital real-time payment infrastructure, or you may have seen pictures of how villagers are using Paytm to buy fish or to make money transfers to each other. So I thought I'll just put together that picture a little bit to set the context. So what has happened is, if you look at this timeline, the story goes back to 2007 and 8, when the Reserve Bank of India actually started with an act that was passed by the Parliament. It's the Payment and Settlement Act. And what this did was to create a whole legislative framework around what later came to be known as Fintech or whatever, but I think this was where it all started. And the formation of the National Payments Council of India, which was a special body that was designed to help real-time payments between individuals. Because if you know about the demographics of the country, it's a large country with a lot of people, rural populations, huge amount of migration, but very young people who tend to use mobile phones a lot. So that's the demographic story. Now, in that demographic story, there's a lot of money moving. So person-to-person transfer was already a very big sector in India, and the existing banking system was not able to solve for it. So this body was primarily created to make sure that retail payment infrastructure got built. And then you had something which became a very big enabler and will continue to be so in the next few years, and that is the digital ID system, because this created the ease. And then you had the licensing of a lot of new banks. By the way, among the 13 people that got the license, there was Paytm, which is one of the world's largest fintech companies with 300 million users. And they got a license to set up a digital bank. And that's what I was heading before I came to Citi. So so there were payment bank licenses. In 2016 was demonetization, which you've heard about it. So one fine day, the Prime Minister went in and announced that the high denomination notes were not accepted anymore. So that created a pressure on people to start using digital payments a lot more. And then, so you have this whole digital payment infrastructure coming up. And then what begins to happen is products. So you have the infrastructure, and as that is developing, with a little bit of a time lag, you start to see the product infrastructure growing. So you have IMPS, Aadhaar-based payments. You have the Jan Dhan Yojana, which was the Prime Minister's scheme that helped open 600 million or so, 300 million bank accounts. So that took the total number of bank accounts to 600 million or so. And then you have the UPI and BBPS. Now, all of this just to tell you the story that when you hear about Paytm's 300 million users, or PhonePay's 100 million, or Google Pay, that's the tip of the iceberg. That's what you see. But at the base of it, there was a lot of activity that has happened, and that has not yet been fully monetized or spread in the 1 billion population of the country. So the scope for that remains, but I just wanted to focus on the public infrastructure creation and the regulatory architecture and how that helped to get us to this point.
Oh, thank you. So it actually takes a lot of cooperation in this. So I will come back to the outcome that you would like to see from this later on. So next, let me move on to one of our private sector representative, Gerald. What are the expectations or outcomes of the private sector that the private sector would love to see in transforming towards the digital era?
Thank you, Sawadee Cup, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I'm honored to be invited to comment. Sorry, I'm just going to flick the slide. So in terms of expectations, I think our view is very similar to the view across the globe by a lot of governments and NGOs and a lot of people who are looking at digital and the promise of digital. While we all kind of focus on digital having made a lot of billionaires and millionaires, and that it will present more efficient experiences for residents as in e-government and create new opportunities, I think they all kind of come down to a few basic fundamentals. I think the first one is, and the governor has mentioned this earlier today, we're looking to actually stimulate innovation and new solutions. This obviously is great because it'll generate, what it should do is actually generate value to the economy, right? But it's not only in terms of making billionaires, but we should also actually look at generating value in terms of employment, and therefore doing more good for the economy than just versus just baseline GDP increase. And lastly, I think the great promise of digital and a digital economy is that it shouldn't just be about UX, it shouldn't just be about money or efficiency, but it's also a wonderful opportunity to drive social inclusion and drive financial inclusion, include SMEs and allow them to be able to get access to funds and to markets that they were never able to do before. So, kind of a little bit for everybody, and a really good example in terms of how this works that happens in Thailand every day today, that didn't happen 10 years ago, was I get around using Grab. And if you think about Grab, it's quite innovative. Most of my drivers today are actually not formal, normal taxi drivers, so it's actually driven somehow a lot of employment. There's certainly revenue being generated for a lot of people. And it goes down to the motorcycle taxis, so there's inclusion, like everyone actually gets to travel, doesn't have to worry about standing in line, and that's one simple example of what a digital economy should look like, where it's really just value across the board and very inclusive in its approach.
Oh, thank you, Gerald. So basically, you would actually like to see the innovations or new solutions that generate value, not for only the rich people, but also going down all the way to the small peoples as well, and doing more goods for the economy. Let me summarize that way. So let's me now turn towards on kind of the policy side. Let me ask Dr. Pakorn to share your views on the outcome you wish to see as we move towards the digital economy, especially in the capital markets.
Sure. Thank you very much. First of all, we at SET really appreciate to be here. On our side, we look at the benefit, the outcome of the use of the technology in three sides. The end user side, the intermediary side, and the infrastructure provider side. First of all, for the end user, we would like the end user to be able to access to the service in a more simple way and in a more secure way. By using the National Digital ID or using the technology, we hope that the two purpose, the two simple and the secure would be able to achieve. On the intermediary side, we would like to provide a service that make the intermediary be able to reach the target wider. Instead of just having to focus on some group, how can they reach out to the broader target group? And also to be able to provide the suitable services to all those group of customers. On the third side, the infrastructure provider. In this part, when you look at the need of the customers and the intermediary side, if they have to reinvest all the infrastructure by every counterparty or every intermediary, it's going to be a huge double investment or multiple investment. So how can someone come in and provide a common infrastructure that has to be a standardized and digital format? So in my opinion, these are the three outcomes of the three groups that we would like to have.
Okay, so this is kind of echoing what Gerald was saying in terms of getting more inclusions, getting more sustained activities in the market, for especially in Thailand, and we're looking forward to see digital gateway from the SET very soon. So next, I would like to ask Dr. Sak. He's, I think, the only person up here from the public sector. So what has been the expected goal you think Thailand would like to see, especially in terms of the role of public sector?
Okay, for Thailand, if you heard the news that we started 5 years ago when the previous government took over, one of the main agenda is digital economy. We even had to change MICT, Ministry of Information and Communication Technology, to Ministry of Digital for Economy and Society. But not just the name, but also change the way, the government, do things with within itself. For example, we have the Digital Economy Committee chaired by the Prime Minister himself. That is why we're serious about this digital economy. And also, in the past 2 or 3 months, Thailand has never seen things like we have 3 or 5 digital laws. One of them is the privacy law. Okay, it took us 20 years to get this law effective. When I came back from England, I'm a scholarship student. We tried so much to, get this law, and never succeed until this year, 20 years. So imagine how serious the government was trying to do with digital economy. Also, we have another law regarding cyber security to make sure that, if you look at the pictures, it means that we're going to entering cashless society led by Bank of Thailand and all the banks. Okay. Last year, when all the banks joined together, no more fee when you transfer money using mobile. It's like explosion, And the next one is a paperless. This is led actually by the government. The cashless and paperless was mentioned in one of the cabinet resolution this year, okay, and was directly ordered Minister of Digital Economy and Society to come up with a plan that Thailand would go into, try to go to cashless and paperless society in the end. I don't know how long would it take, but you starting to know the cashless is going everywhere now. I even asked a friend who actually transferred the money using mobile banking, only 1 baht. Imagine that. Now you don't have any limitation in doing with the money. The paperless. I was this morning at the government building, addressing all agencies that from now documents issued by government agency would be digital. We start with 50 license, okay? But before that, the Department of Land Transport just announced that Thai people now can use mobile app from the agency to show to the police, your driving license, digital one, and it's legal. Imagine that. Now, cashless, paperless, definitely on the way. But the third one, I don't know, the new government has planned to, to accommodate this or not, but it's happening right now. It's happening right now, tablets, okay? So from my view, these 3 goals would be the outcome of digital economy. But I would say later, how are we going to do that later? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So in terms of cashless, I think we have seen some of the evidence, and some of us, or most of us here in this room, actually facing the cashless society now. In terms of paperless, I think it will be gradual, since government sector is quite big, but it's very promising that this government really, really wants to push this to happen. And in terms of staffless, I don't know that would affect me as well. So, yes, please.
I just came back from Singapore the other day, attending this conference. Anyway, when I check out from my hotel, normally you would have to sign on the paper, something like that. But I was asked to sign on the iPad. That is paperless going on right now. I don't know if it's legal in Thailand or not, but in Singapore it seems legal. Yeah, but definitely paperless is coming, for sure.
I think it's legal, but whether in practice people would accept it or not, that's the key for Thailand, I think. Thank you, Dr. Sak. So Shinjini, let me come back to you on the outcome. You promised to tell us what would you like to see as an outcome in India, your country.
Sure.
Yeah.
So 2 things. First of all, I'm really privileged to be sitting here and listening to my fellow panelists about the commitment of the government, which seems to be very high on and driven from the top, because sometimes that makes a huge amount of difference. But I wanted to put some faces to this conversation And where is my friend
Can
on
we
the
have
slides?
slides?
Yes. So if I can just show you a few faces of how does this whole digital conversation actually work for real people. So, so these are just some cases of how the government interaction with people is a huge driver of digital engagement. And you know, the two of you are the vectors that you talked about, which is paperless and cashless, because all government transactions involve some form of payment and some form of paper, right? And I think when we talk about a person like this IT professional in Mumbai, she could be applying for a scholarship on a portal. She could be asking for a tax refund. She could be paying a toll. She could be traveling in the train. She could be filing her tax return or whatever. Now, what we tried to do was to tell you what, for a country like India, is the throughput that is already happening on some of these use cases. And obviously, that's not from one professional, that's from multiple people like her. And that market will keep growing, and that market will keep increasing this throughput. What we have not put on these slides is the use cases that further get built by the private sector on top of all of this. So if you think about what happens when a private agency begins to overlay a range of services on top of the railway digitization, and then begins to offer you pizza while you are traveling in the train. By the way, that's not one of my favorite things with grown-up, boys who will order pizza all the time. But, and it worries me to death that people will be throwing trash on the railway tracks. But having said that, it's really the kind of the thing that the private sector begin to create quickly as soon as the government puts in place these use cases. Then I just wanted to put a few more faces to this. So if you think about this farmer in a village in Telangana. By the way, Telangana has been one of our high success stories because the chief minister, and this is to the point of the government's driving it and the personal involvement, as you said, of the, from the top. So this chief minister has been very, very proactive in driving. In fact, I met him when I used to work in Paytm and demonetization happened. And I was very impressed with the vision he had for ordinary people, villagers, to participate in his digital agenda. So he said he's creating a geo map of resources in the entire state. And because India is a very large country, lots of people, lots of villages, so not everything is mapped very well. So he had this program where if you lived in a village, you could go and take picture of a public utility, public resource like a water, a well, and send it to the government to include in their mapping, and you would get paid like some really small amount of money. And he wanted us at Paytm to solve for that problem because the cost of transferring that small amount of money wasn't working out for them. So I'm just saying the kind of life that each part of the population lives and what can the government do around it. So if you think about this farmer, he could be buying insurance, he could be going on an online marketplace and selling crop, he could be taking a crop loan, he could be a recipient of a direct benefit transfer, he could be participating in an employment guarantee scheme in a season when his own crop is not working. And this is the kind of beneficiaries that are already stacked against a program like this. And again, bear in mind what the private sector can do on top of this. Then I'll just quickly go through a couple more cases and stop. So this is a sector where we expect major changes because the small business in India is the norm rather than exception. Large businesses are still exception. So the vast part of the country lives on small businesses, which is not very different from other countries, except that the scale of it is very large in India. And therefore, you start realizing that when the small industries begin to get into the government, and to some extent, they have stayed out of the government net for their own preferences, right? They've not wanted to pay taxes. They haven't wanted to be visible because the whole formal economy model doesn't work for them. But you start seeing this happening and it begins to add its own momentum and creates its own value. So you start seeing that they can participate in government tendering through the e-procurement activity. So somebody sitting in a remote village in Bihar who earlier couldn't participate in a government program because they didn't have the infrastructure to do that, can now do it because they can just log in from there and participate, so the costs become low. There's a huge amount of emphasis on subsidies and the delivery of the subsidies. There are taxes to be paid. There is the whole new GST program. And I've been told that every government that implements GST loses, and Mr. Modi bucked that trend. He implemented GST, he still came back to power. And so I think this is another one of those infrastructure things that we expect will create a lot of benefit, particularly to the digital economy. Or similarly, excise duty, because again, large country, you move goods from place to place and all that stuff. So I think, again, the size of that market is growing. It's large already, and it's growing on a daily basis as we speak. And this is my last and favorite use case. So this is a migrant worker. And what does he do in his life? Like he takes travel, he recharges his phone, he can participate in the employee provident. I'm only mapping here the use cases that are delivered by public utilities or government. I'm not adding to this the private utilities, because that makes it immensely more interesting and just shoots up the throughput and the number of transactions. But just to make the government point, this man will send money to his wife, who using the Aadhaar-enabled payment system, and she can then further use it for paying the government utilities, pay the child's fees if he's going into a public or private school. She can participate in the Rural Livelihood Mission program and receive some money from there, and she could be participating in other health and welfare schemes. Now, this is the last one that I'm using right now, but these are the public use cases, and this is the size of the market. But you add to that private use cases, and as I was telling at lunch, for a country of this size, the day-to-day transactions of just buying fish, buying vegetables, getting haircuts, arranging birthday parties, delivering cakes, just about any personal use case you take, and you multiply that by the number of people and the occasion of the event. So a birthday cake will be 1 per year per person, but a haircut will be 1 per person per month. And then you start to put the dollar number on that and see the throughput of the money that is moving, and it's just a mind-blowing number, okay? Now the thing is that it's not, done in a day, so the core infrastructure is there, and then the whole collaboration between public and private and how does that come along will determine where we will be having this, seeing this ecosystem in a few years from now.
Yeah, thank you. That were very interesting use cases, and actually give us the idea that when India is actually trying to move towards digital economy, they're starting with thinking about people, touching the people's life, and also small businesses. Provide the infrastructures, and then they hope that, and it actually happened, that the private sector added on to create value. Right? So these are the first vision or question of the panelists, their visions in terms of what they would like to see as an outcome going towards the digital economy. So from what we heard the common goal, right? Because everyone wants to see innovation, collaboration to enhance productivity, inclusivity, and in a sustainable manner. I think this should be able to summarize the first questions quite okay. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, given that we have already heard about those outcomes, why the world is changing every day, technology is changing really fast, how we should pursue, and what would be good plans to help us achieve our desired outcome that we mentioned earlier. In other words, what would be the key success factors in reaching those goals? So let me start with the private sector again. Gerald, what do you think are the prerequisites, and how the financial service providers can leverage on digital infrastructure to improve financial services?
Thank you. Well, we're largely in fintech. I'm going to talk about what we expect from policymakers across the board, in all industries as we try to get to a digital economy. And, in sticking with the theme that I had talked about earlier, where, it's about new models, it's about growth and employment, and it's also about inclusion, I would like to talk about where the government or regulators or policymakers are uniquely positioned to help accelerate the growth. And I'll share some examples, although, I actually don't have nice photos of people to actually show the impact, which I should have. a couple of themes I want to talk about how governments can actually encourage the growth of a digital economy. The first is being the guardian and the driver of trust. And I think a lot of people have talked about security and privacy. My fellow parliament members have talked about it. We also have certain tech companies in the media for all the wrong reasons because of how they are not acting in the best interest of their customers. And so trust is extremely central from both a data privacy perspective, but also do I trust that what I want or my intentions will actually be carried out, and that I'm not necessarily the product of what you're doing. That's in a resident or a consumer's perspective. When you extend the trust over to a business, then it's about moving from bankers trusting SMEs for the paperwork that they submit as a reflection of their business, but also other parties, right? Insurance companies and their counterparts saying, should I buy or sell from this company? How can I trust them? How can I trust the digital data that is coming across? And in the event that the digital data that comes across is not an accurate reflection, what are some of my recourse against non-authentic data coming across? So all of that is a space where policymakers are uniquely positioned to deliver. The second point, I think, which the BOT governor also pointed out earlier this morning, is around standards. And I don't want to belabor this point because I think everybody kind of gets standards. What I do want to share is actually when standards work, you don't think about it, right? And there are two great examples I love to share. The first thing is, I can see some of you here in the audience are around my generation or slightly more senior, but I think we all remember the time where if you had a couple of mobile phones, you would have different kind of chargers for each mobile phone. Like every series of Nokia I had a different charger. And I had a whole drawer full of chargers so I can manage it, right? And then EU regulators came in and said, we're all moving to USB. Now I have like a few standard cables and that's it, right? Which is wonderful. So standards make a huge impact from a consumer perspective. But again, when it comes to business perspective, and Bangkok is heavily on waterways and ports nearby, if you think about containers, we all take these trucks moving by for granted today, right? No one thinks about it. When you see a 40-foot container, you just like, it was because of the standard and global convention that we have that. If we didn't have that, can you imagine what size trucks people would have to build and how difficult it would be to actually load a ship? Because you have non-standard containers, right? So standards make a huge deal. They impact consumer experience and they allow everybody to play. Now, the biggest result of standards, which I do want to highlight, is the inclusion aspect of standards for everyone in the street as well as for businesses. Unlike big businesses, which I represent and many of you represent as well, whom for us usually our connectivity discussions are, okay, we agree to do something, let's stand up a team of 20 people, spend $200,000 in 6 months and we can do it. An SME has no ability to do this stuff. Zero. They don't even have a CTO. Without standards, you just would not be able to include SMEs at all. I won't touch on pragmatic policy making because I think BOT has done a great job and the governor has actually talked about it. But what I do want to also share is the issue of talent, especially in a staffless world, and the issue of capacity building as the counter edge of that. When it comes to talent, even the top IT companies actually depend on policymakers and governments to develop the talent of tomorrow, today, right? So what's happening in schools, that's what impacts the competitiveness of a country. More importantly, because we go through technology cycles so rapidly, right? Every time Google and iPhone come out with new stuff, the whole landscape changes, right? Every year or so. The whole issue of talent redevelopment, retraining, because certain jobs have become obsolete because there's no needed anymore. That's a key issue where we really need policymakers to come in and have a very active hand in actually shaping and predicting where the new demands are going to be not just to say, to ensure that people aren't jobless, but to move people up the pecking order in terms of getting better paying jobs and more fulfilling jobs, right? Less manual jobs. And a very good, a very analogous journey to talent is actually on the business side, talking about how we enable and capacity build for small businesses, right? I think most of you would have noticed that there's a huge digital divide between SMEs and big business. True, there are some SMEs who started by college students and they're digital from day one by default. But the vast majority of the businesses that we interact with, you know, our uncle that sells us pad thai, the provision shops that we go to, the marketplaces, where we service our car, have been handed down 2 to 3 generations. And for them, you know, like e-invoice is putting something on Excel, right? They don't really understand the value of going digital, which means that as we come up with a digital economy, they are by definition excluded, right? So I'm not saying that the government is entirely responsible for this, but I think the government has a big role in orchestrating a response to include them so that these SMEs can be digital, they can see the benefit of being digital, and can participate in the economy. So those are what I would say are the expectations of the private industry in terms of, you know, getting a country ready for digital.
Thank you, Gerald. That's very interesting. My take on your view is that trust, standards, and talents, they actually have been there in terms of driving the economy. But in this era, we probably have to look at it in a different angles, right? And that's why I think capacity building and also pragmatic policy comes into play. And that should help us change our views, our thoughts, our behaviors, and eventually it will become natural. We just have to do it, right? And I hope that we don't have to wait till next generation to see that. Now let me turn to Dr. Sak. Could you share with us how we should proceed to reach the goals that you were mentioning? And what should be the prioritization of the national policy as well as the role of public sector?
Okay, can I have my slide, please? Okay. The government needs to make sure that, you know, these 3 elements are okay. Kun Pakorn mentioned digital ID. Okay, I was in Geneva early this year. There was talk about issuing digital ID for the whole world, something like that. Okay, who would actually issue these IDs to citizens of your country? How can my digital ID and you from different countries can interact? Who's gonna, you know, say it's okay or not? I think one of the reasons why RIBA, you know, was so against, it's not about the payment, it's about the ID for me. Okay? So government needs to make sure that we have a very, very good system to, you know, issue digital ID to the citizen. Then digital payment, okay, which I think BOT has done a very good job, and all the banks in Thailand are, I think, working very, very well in, you know, making sure that, you know, digital payment in Thailand is inclusive, right? But the tricky one is the digital data. I intentionally select this picture because when we're talking about data, it's not about database. Okay, it's everything. I once read an article and it said, everything that can be digital will be. And this morning I read the news that the second city in the US, Oakland, I think, just announced they ban the use of facial recognition. Now, the government needs to be very, very careful about digital data. So basically, we need to make sure that digital ID, digital payment, or digital data are done with respect to the 3 principles: security, privacy, but for me, very, very, probably the most challenging one is ethics. Right now, there are more than 61 ethics frameworks around the world. So we don't know what to choose. EU just announced the AI ethics. Okay, OECD just announced last month, and 40 countries have agreed to, use OECD ethic principles. We're gonna have some trouble in implementing ethics for sure. So all in all, okay, for me, digital economy is digital service. That's all. But it must be done in a way that you have to protect the citizen. You have to make sure that there's no privacy issues and also ethics too. So make sure the three elements are done correctly. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. So you were saying that the best approach in terms of driving towards the digital economy for, let's say, for the public sector, infrastructure would be the ID, digital ID, because that would also connect it to the digital payment, and also, the use of digital data in various angles, right? And definitely, of course, you want to emphasize that it has to be done thinking about security, privacy, and also ethics. And I don't know whether a lot of you who are from Thailand, which is probably more than half in this room, feel like me. When Gerald was saying that, trust talent, and it looks, to us, it sounds very promising, but we can wait for that to gradually happen. But when we see what Dr. Sak is providing us here, it's like we want it now, we want to happen now. So that's how I feel at the moment, and I hope you feel the same way. Okay. Now let me turn to Dr. Pakorn. Since the set has involved with both private and public sector in terms of financial development, how do you suggest the two sectors should collaborate in developing core system of financial and capital markets that support the development of our digital economy?
Thank you. May I have my slide, page 2, please? Yes, thank you. When we look at the financial services that we are providing at the moment, you will notice that actually on the left-hand side of the slide is the investment consultant. The thing that nowadays we use the most of the technology on the e-open account, e-KYC, e-suitability. You can notice that even for the use of these few options, our infrastructure on these financial services is not that adequate yet. When you look at each financial intermediary, they invest in their own infrastructure. However, why should they do that? It's so inefficient. Like Dr. Sak mentioned, how can we get the infrastructure to support all the payment, all the e-open account? Now, let's think about that. Next step, if we move to the banking sector, which is a lot bigger than the investment sector, now we have 70 million accounts who are going to do the open account every day, do the transaction every day, do the payment, do many things, withdrawing, transferring the money. Now we need more digital KYC, suitability, and other things. And now let's think about inclusion into other things. Instead of using all these facility for the financial sector, but we start to use it for our normal life, starting from like going to hospital, get the medicine, do other things, product and services in the real sector. Do we have the infrastructure to support that yet? The infrastructure that can link both the financial side and the real sector side? I don't think so. Actually, Dr. Sak mentioned something very interesting about Libra. In my opinion, the idea of Libra is not good just for the payment, but it's the linkage between the real sector and the financial sector. That is the thing that I deem it so important. And then let's think about the food and transportation and other things. If you are Thai people, you're going to be frustrated that if you want to go to the subway, you want to go to the SkyTrain, you want to use the expressway, motorway, or the expressway, or anything, you want to use the bus, you have to have like 5 cards, 5 tokens, something like that. How could we have 7? Sorry about that. How can we have a simple one common token that we can use everywhere, something like oyster, something like that, that we can do? Moreover, when in the future what you want to do a payment settlement, not just on the large amount, but like donation or small amount, the changes, how can we convert that into investment, convert that to the donation or anything? How can we do it at 7-Eleven? How can we do it at top supermarket? How can we do it anywhere that you want to do? These are the things that demand a huge investment in the infrastructure of this kind of like platform, the new technology platform. And now, how can we create that? If we wait to the government, I don't know how long it's going to take. If we want to have the private sector doing it, I don't know how many multiple investment that we will do that is redundant. How can we have a collaboration between the private sector and public sector and come up with a platform that service all these things in the future? How can we have the trusted infrastructure? This is very important. Libra has one weak spot. Nowadays, not many people trust Facebook. How can we have one single entity that could perform that function with a trust asset? And also, this entity need to be able to discover the common need of all these people in the ecosystem. How can we get that? That's why to create this collaboration is so important. It's not just a government or the private sector side, but it has to be the collaboration. So in my opinion, the collaboration with the clear of the policy, with the clear of the regulation, and with the need for the mutual common benefit infrastructure would be so important.
Yes, please.
By the way, digital ID, that would be, I think, trial by the end of this year. In the future, it will be used by the government and the public sector. It's not a policy, it's a law in the Digital Government Act. For Thailand, digital government is not a policy, it's a law, okay? So, as Khun Pakorn mentioned, that the collaboration is very important. I would say in my slide, okay, what should be the best way of doing digital economy for Thailand? Okay.
Thank you. So what we see, it's very good to see that the financial infrastructure that we maybe like invest a lot to make it happen now can reach out to the community, to the real sector, and for that to happen efficiently. Khun Pakorn said that we really need collaboration between private sector and public sector, and that would create trust, and also the public sector also have to provide the clear policy, and the two sectors will also have to work on mutual benefits of customers and also businesses. So this is how I take from this. So last but not least, Shinjini, what are the key success factors for India?
You know, I was looking at everyone's slides and I was thinking, what's there to add to this? Because I think we've just covered everything. And I know that I'm on a panel where we're talking about policy and government, but it's post-lunch, so let me just tell you a couple of stories. So, you know, I woke up yesterday and found on my Twitter feed a lot of young women in India very angry about some news story about the fact that in rural Gujarat, girls are not allowed access to smartphones. And these young urban women had discovered it for the first time, I think, which says something about their knowledge level. But actually, across the board in India, girls in rural India are not allowed access to smartphones. So if there's one smartphone in the house, it's usually with the man. And the girl, if at all, is given some old feature phone. And the reason for that is that the mothers or the fathers or the community or everybody is very scared about what these girls will do with their smartphones, because they'll probably take their pictures and send it to guys or whatever. So it's a major fear. Technology drives fear in our hearts. And when I think about it, because I've had to deal with this on all sides. So as you know, I've been a regulator, I've been a consultant, I've been a fintech person, and now I'm in a bank. So I've seen this fear from every perspective. So let me just talk a little bit about how I look at this and how that will play out into this entire process. So when you think about Henry Ford's car, what happened when cars were first put on the roads? Like, can you imagine how the guys who were driving horses and horse carts felt about this sudden machine that was coming their way that they didn't know whether it would really stop when it saw a real human being or a horse? Like, can you imagine what it would have felt like to the city council, the mayor going on his horse to think that from tomorrow on this road there will be cars, and who's going to build all the roads on which there'll be cars, and these cars are going to drink petrol, and where's that petrol going to come from, and where will people go and fill petrol, for heaven's sake, in their cars? Because we all know that horses eat grass and we know where to find the grass, but who knows where to find the petrol? Like, can you imagine that, right? But what happened? What happened was cars happened, because they were a futuristic technology. And I've been a literature student, and one of my favorite books is Grapes of Wrath. And when you read that book, any of you who's read that book and reread it, I was rereading it when I was working at PTM, and I was thinking, oh my God, it never occurred to me this book wasn't about people. This book was about technology. This book was about saying what automobiles did to people that didn't know how to deal with it. So there's a reason in the end that the kid who survives is the kid who becomes an auto mechanic. I don't think the author thought about it that way, but there's a lesson there. So the reason I'm belaboring this story of the automobile is because the ecosystem will grow for a futuristic technology and will be built by various peoples that you have no idea will come from somewhere and build it. That faith and that trust today is very hard for us. And the reason it is hard for us is because the whole Cold War era in which governments built technology, in which governments owned major parts of technology, the massive servers that happened, the massive space explorations that happened, the massive amount of money that got into it, was all done by governments that created institutions, that created innovation, that created the world in which we live. So the world in which we live, the responsibility was taken by the governments to ensure delivery of Medicare to people, delivery of social goods to people, delivery of public infrastructure, parks, education to people. It's a great thing. It brought civilization ahead. It has brought us to where we are. But what's happening today? What's happening today is that somebody is sitting in the valley, builds something like a WhatsApp, and it's a small thing. It's meant for people to just talk to each other. And what happens with that? The guy sitting next to me in an aircraft, this is like 5 years ago when WhatsApp had just launched, before the aircraft takes off, and I'm just watching his screen because he's sitting right next to me in, small place. And he's taking orders on his phone. He can't write English, so he's typing his own language in the Roman script. He's accepting orders, he's sending pictures, and by the time his airplane starts, he has done his deal. That capability did not exist for him to do until that smartphone happened. The guy is not literate, doesn't know English. So when I used to be in Paytm, a lot of people used to ask me, India has so many illiterate people, how will this whole progress to digital happen? And I used to tell them something, which is maybe many of you will empathize with, is at least in India, when you buy a new piece of household equipment, like a washing machine or a microwave or whatever, sophisticated equipment, who learns to use it? Who learns to use it? If you have a maid in the house, she's the one who learns to use it the fastest. And I'm sorry to say this, but your grown-up son or your husband are very unlikely to learn to use it. Even though they are smarter, they have PhDs. Mine has a PhD. So you just find that technology has to be built to be used. Once it's out there, who drives cars? Drivers. Like, who fixes your car when it's with the Mercedes that doesn't work? Who fixes it? I don't fix it. The PhD doesn't fix it. The guy who fixes it knows how to fix cars. So let's have some trust in technology, especially today, when the consumer has suddenly been empowered with more computing power than any institution. So the consumer is going around with a smartphone in their hands, taking better pictures than, I'm sorry to say, but, nice pictures, but we will never see those pictures, but we will see all the selfies, they'll be on Twitter, Insta. It has just changed. And the fact that it has changed, the fact that it has put more power into the people are rating each other and going and living in each other's homes. Can you imagine? Like an Airbnb, which I went to live in Brighton, the guy had a liquor cabinet full of choicest scotch, and he just leaves it open, and he says, I'm fine what you want to drink as long as you replace it. There's the next shop. So the kind of trust that people are building with each other basis the new technology is the trust that policymakers will have to learn to understand and trust. It's very hard. It's not easy. And especially I find in my country, and I don't know much about other countries, but I do find that having been a regulator, it's not the easiest thing to do. But I guess, there'll be a little push and pull, but it will happen.
Thank you. So you actually mentioned a lot of cases that are very interesting and useful for all of us here to look at this in a different angles, right? So trust doesn't happen so easily because people have fears, and people are fearing what they don't know. And I think the government or public sector that would have to help stepping in, like Dr. Sak was saying, in terms of ethics and policies, and right. So that's very important. So, and I hope that this, if the infrastructure is there, people can adapt, and this will eventually create trust among all of us in the new landscape of the economy, because I think things will change, like what Gerald has said as well. Okay, so in terms of this approach towards the digital economy, all the panelists have mentioned, we probably heard a lot about trust, about public and private partnership. We're not talking about participation anymore. We're talking about like partnering, looking into the mutual interests, and also policy, which is the soft infrastructure that also have to be developed over time as well. So now for the last question, since we have a very little bit of time, maybe I ask you guys to shorten it a little bit. We have seen good success stories. We have seen good plans and also good wills from our panelists. So nonetheless, all the roads towards success may not be so well paved. So to better prepare for our journey, we might want to foresee challenges and obstacles. So I would like to hear from the panelists, what are the major challenges that could deviate you from your plan and approach to overcome them? So let me start with you back again, Shinjini. Can you share with us the challenge India has faced or what has yet to be overcome that you haven't talked about?
She picked on me because she thought I've always been getting the advantage of hearing everybody's views.
Sorry.
So thank you. No, so I think the challenge, I think what you said about ethics, I think that remains always a very important challenge, because the truth is that, it's like dealing with a grown-up child. You don't know on what date, at what time, at what period of his life and your life you're going to let your child go. It's very tough. There's no science to it. And it always has to be a mutually understood, calibrated exercise. And we will have systems which will sometimes fail. What is our ability to minimize that damage proactively and retrospectively are going to be very important to the growth of the ecosystem. So I think I would just focus completely and obsessively on that.
Thank you. So now let me hear from you, Gerald.
Can I have my slide? Yeah, just very quickly in terms of the challenges, and I wanted to offer also some ways to get around the challenges. In terms of digital ecosystems, if we're truly this is an important point. When you think about digital economy, you're thinking about people's journeys that work. You're not just thinking about I take the train. You're thinking about I am trying to get to work. So I may cycle, walk, take a taxi, take a train, take a tuk-tuk to do that, and then pick up breakfast on the way. You're actually thinking about that kind of integration. When you have that frame of mind, the issues aren't around technology, right? The issues is this, like with Thailand and on the different cards, the issues are about ecosystem fragmentation. Everybody thinks that they have a right to play, and they have equal or more right than everybody else. That's the first challenge. The second challenge is, even if you can get everybody agree to a central fair ecosystem, then it gets to the point who pays for it. That's a very touchy issue, right? Because then, BTS will say, oh, everybody shares equally. Some other party will say, you have the most train stops, you need to pay more. So that's always a challenge. Then it's an issue of talking about access and scale and security and privacy, where everybody's kind of talked about those issues. So I'll kind of skip those. But what I wanted to actually spend some time is to actually highlight to everybody that there are easy ways to get around these challenges, right? The first thing is that there are networks out there, right? So if a government's trying to do something, like I won't mention some government in ASEAN, not Thailand, but they tried to give out subsidies. And of their $50 million budget, $36 million was spent. This was a fuel subsidy. They spent $36 million printing cards. And then I don't know how much money they spent distributing the cards. But when I spoke to them, I said, everybody has a card in the wallet, everybody's got a smartphone, everybody's banked. You should have just come to talk to us. You just tell us who needs to receive this, and we would actually set it up for you, right? So there are networks out there with tremendous reach. In Thailand, 7-Eleven reaches every street corner. If your strategy is not about working with these people, then it's going to be very costly. Standards, and these networks are a related question. If you're not actually leveraging standards, it's like when you get to a store and you see that, I don't know about here, it seems quite efficient, but in Singapore, when you get to some electronic stores, there are like 15 bank terminals. Because if you want installment from one bank, there's like one terminal. And it's crazy, right? When you're not using standards, there's even not enough space for all this stuff. So it makes very little sense, and it's very hard to scale. And it's definitely not very inclusive. So if these two things are employed together, the net impact is what's important. Would everybody here at Thailand focus on building your national network and national things? Or should you just leverage international networks that other people have invested in and says, I will take all this, but I will work on leapfrogging, on creating even better value than the next country and next city, right? I think that's where the battle is going to be. Focus on using what other people have already done and develop something new. And lastly, to my panel's point, PPPs, private-public partnerships, are extremely important to establish central solutions to get around fragmentation and get around investment. Now, they do two things, right? The first thing is that with these structures, it takes some time to build, but essentially what happens is that there's an alignment between the government's needs, there is incentive for the private companies, enterprises to play, and most importantly, through a PPP, you can align on one method to do things. And most importantly, once you've done that, you can then get third parties to come and invest in the infrastructure, which is, when you do it standardized, it's going to be more expensive than anyone standing up their own, right? When this happens, incredible things happens with digital infrastructure. It starts to look like something we all know. If we want to build a highway, and I've been to Thailand many, many years now, I won't mention how many. I remember there was no highway to, even Lopburi, and when the highway was new, and then one was built to Pattaya, and all these different. When the highway got built, it was amazing. But how does a country with no budget build a highway? You grant a concession, they set up a toll booth, right? When you have a PPP, what you're essentially doing is like, subject to certain rules and ethics imposed by the government, they're going to issue a concession. And everybody who is actually getting the benefit of this starts to pay per use. And it's as revolutionary as saying, in the old days, when you wanted a photocopier, you bought one, right? And it cost you a few $1,000s. Now they come, they give you one, and someone counts, or actually no one comes anymore. A modem actually tells the photocopying company or the printing company how many times you use it, and you pay per click, right? So that's the wonderful thing about digital infrastructure. It's not about the technology, but we really, coming back to the theme of this conference, we really need to figure out how to collaborate more effectively. And if we do so, all these things are possible, but the fundamentals to fix are actually not hard. It's not rocket science, right? But a lot of egos typically get in the way when we try to do stuff like that.
So thank you. Next, I would like to hear from Dr. Sak, please.
Okay. Can I have my slide, please? Well, for me, okay, the challenge is, I think we are now experiencing decision to be made. Government need to balance. Not everyone would be centralized. Not everything would be decentralized. Okay? You may choose to open for certain things, but for other things, it could be proprietary. Maybe because it's national security, trade secret, and so on. Some of the things that are emerging, for example, tech drone. You know that there are only 6 countries in the world that allow their citizens to fly drones without, restrictions. Only 6. The rest of the world take very, very cautious, on let their citizens drive drone. So the government should be very, very careful. You want to regulate or you want to be self-regulate, okay? But in the end, I think right now it's a battle between protection and innovation. You're going to have to find the right balance, okay? For example, in China, I mean, you know that, in order to train the AI for the, facial recognition, you have plenty of samples because people in China, they don't care about privacy. But on the other hand, people in the EU with the GDPR, it's very difficult to get this kind of data. But it means that to make AI better in the EU, it would be a lot difficult, more difficult than in China. I don't know, Thailand would choose which one. But our data is now in Facebook server, in Google's, in anyway. So my conclusion is that government needs to be very, very careful. They need to have some sort of the right strategies in choosing, what would be the right balance for digital economy for Thailand. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Pakorn, may I hear from you? What
Thank
do
you
see
very
as
much.
obstacles?
I would say that all of my panelists has been touching on the very important issue. So I would like to add on one more thing. How can we come up with the right balance between the protection and the innovation? That is the hardest question. In my opinion, the first thing that we need to do is that we need to find out the pain point or the need, the common need that all people want. After that, how can the government provide a clear and fair legal framework that would provide something like certainty, promote standardization, promote collaboration, and incentivize for adoption and migration? Those are the most important things in my opinion. Other than that, the private sector can find a solution. We need just a foundation that we can work on. So after we have all this legal framework ready, what's next? First, like I told you before, find a use case, find a pain point of the industry, find a pain point of the mass, the people that they have, and then how can we start it small? How can we start it small and then we find a minimum viable product that can be improved in the future, can be extended in the future, complying with all the rule and regulation that they have, at the government had. So in that case, we would be able to extend all the coverage of either the financial services or the real sector services in the future. So that's my opinion. Thank you.
Just to add one small point to what you said, very important, is the liability structure. Because the difference between cash and digital is that in cash, it's a bearer instrument, so the liability resides with the person who's carrying that note. So if you have an earthquake and all the currency of that village gets destroyed, it's a very sad thing, but the expectation from the holder of that cash is not an immediate replacement. But if you have a server attack on digital currency, then obviously the liability continues to reside with the service provider and therefore the regulator and therefore the government. So there is a very good reason for us to understand that and to figure out how those liability structures can be taken care of, and that's a very critical infrastructure. So I think that's a very big point.
Yeah, and if I might just add very quickly one point, I think finding the balance is more complicated than my panelists have put here. And the reason why I want to point that out is that in a specific use case, there may be parts of it where the government wants to hold proprietary. I'll give you an example in trade. No country wants to give up its invoice or collateral registry. But at the same time, they want to be openly able to share the information. So many times, what we all deal with, regulators and private, is how do we deal with the paradoxes? You have both reasons to do it at different segments, and how to that balance is not an either or, it's where, right? So that was an important thing I just want to highlight.
Yeah, I just hope that trying to find the right balance will not lead us to an inaction bias. That's a very scary thing to see going forward for all of us. So we probably don't have time anymore for questions from the floor. I'm very sorry. But then the speakers will be walking around, and you can actually ask them in person, and that might be better. You might hear more sincere and direct answers from them. Okay, so we also heard a lot today on innovation, protection, trust, what else? Collaboration and mutual interest of public and private sectors. So I believe that an effective, like what Gerald was saying, effective collaboration and communication amongst all parties, as well as effective governance structure, would assure that our digital economy infrastructures are designed to best serve the public sector's goals, the private sector's needs, and the consumer's interests and trust. So after all, we only would like to see the digital transformation that help bring up the country's standard of living, better productivities, and also better connection to the world economy in a sustainable manner. So I hope this session helps all of us to have clearer picture of these goals and how to reach them. So on behalf of the Bank of Thailand, I would like to thank all the distinguished panelists for comprehensive views and in these important matters. And may I ask you all to join me in giving them a big round of applause. Thank you.